Hello and welcome to this virtual rally for Socialist Alternative. Today we will be speaking about the issues facing young workers and students during this corona crisis. Just wanted to start by saying, please, if you could share this video, invite some of your friends who you think might be interested, that'd be really helpful. There's going to be a lot of good discussion, and I think it could help people, understand some of the issues that are going on. So it'd be great if you could just, start a watch party, share it, invite people. That'd be fantastic. So I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Jade. I'm a Socialist Alternative member in Leicester, and I'm currently furloughed from work. We also have Neil Moore.
Hi there, I'm Neil Moore. I'm based in Belfast, and I'm a hospitality organiser with Unite the Union. And I lead a relatively new campaign we've been about for about a year, which is organising young precarious hospitality workers in a notoriously exploitative and low-paid industry.
Neil. Next we have Aimée Lê.
Hi, I'm a creative writing lecturer right now at University of Exeter in the Penryn branch based in Cornwall. I'm a Socialist Alternative member, and I'm a member of UCU, and I recently started up the campaign Corona Contract to try, along with other organizers, to try to get a 2-year extension for all casualized workers during this period.
Thank you very much. Next, we've got Tom Costello.
Hi, my name's Tom. I'm a member of Socialist Alternative in Salford, and I also am a member of its political committee.
Thank you very much, Tom. Next, we've got Jack Yarlett.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm a member of Socialist Alternative. I work doing content writing for the website of a legal firm. I'm currently furloughed and staying at home.
Thank you very much. And next we have Charlie.
Hi, I'm Charlie Dick. I'm a Socialist Alternative member in Huddersfield. I'm also a postgraduate student and organiser at the University of Huddersfield.
Thank you very much. Right, so just a quick introduction to how this discussion is going to go. We've had some stories sent in to us by students and young workers. I'm going to read out the stories to you, and then I'll throw it to some of our panelists, and they'll sort of discuss some of the key points being brought out here, during the corona crisis. So we'll get straight into it. Our first story is from Connor in Brighton, who says, "I am still working as I work at a convenience store. Being in the middle of a city, we used to serve mostly workers and tourists. Now we serve very few people in a day. As a result of the lost income, we are starting to see pressure for workers to go home early and work reduced hours. For many of us who work there, this job is a key source of income, as others in our households are without work altogether. Store closes, I and other colleagues would be happy to temporarily relocate to a bigger store, but the company seems to want to keep our shop open for as long as possible, even if it affects our pay." So Neil, this outbreak has thrust to the centre of discussion the subject of young workers' rights. Tell us a bit about your work in Unite Hospitality Northern Ireland, organising around this issue.
Yeah, and as I said, we're a campaign that's run by and for hospitality workers, and it's very much really hit on the change that's been happening over the past few years, where we've seen a huge increase in strikes and industrial action across the UK and Ireland, and a certain confidence from people that you can actually get organised, fight back, and win concessions coming out of a decade of austerity now. You have workers, rightfully demanding their share of the recovery and their piece of the pie. I think the issue that's been talked about there in the shops actually very similar to what we faced in bars in Belfast coming up to very busy St. Patrick's Day, where the Johnson government and the Northern Ireland Executive held off on this idea of a lockdown, on this idea of closing non-essential businesses, despite huge pressure from workers, which finally led them to do that. And you had some bars that were closing, you had other bars that were reducing the amount of staff and greedily staying open. So we acted on that. We assisted workers that wanted to do something about that, to get organised, and we supported a protest of workers where we went bar by bar, protesting, naming and shaming, and calling out these employers, their callous, disregard, putting the money in the till over not only the safety of their staff, but public health in general. With less bars being open, it meant that there were going to be more people crammed into a smaller number of bars, and that was surprisingly effective. You've seen a number of bars closing just hours after that protest and taking the decision to close for the rest of the day. And it shows that when we push back and when we're organised, we can win. I think since then the biggest kind of challenge for us in the unions has been maintaining a response to this given lockdown. And what we've seen is a huge growth and amount of queries coming through, people who are looking supported whilst they're being on furlough, people raising concerns around PPE and health and safety not being taken seriously at work. I mean, we've examples of burrito bars where they closed for a few days, reopened, and claimed that there was proper PPE and social distancing measures in place. But what was in reality was a manager telling people whenever they stood a bit too close to each other behind a crammed, deli counter to space themselves out again. Never mind traveling into work, never mind the fact that they were exposed to takeaway drivers. They were still open to the general public for collection at that point. So we were able to get those workers organised. They weren't previously in a union. They organised themselves through WhatsApp, came up with a common set of demands, and used the union as a vehicle to struggle and to put pressure on those demands. And it really goes to show that when we have a collective response, when workers stick together and have each other's backs, not only can we get proper social distancing and PPE put in place, but when businesses aren't essential, and when workers' lives are being put at risk, as they so callously are by this system, trying to maintain the economy, and effectively blackmailing people over, well, it's your jobs versus health, we can shut it down and we can win victories.
Thank you very much for that, Neil. Really good to hear stories of, employees being able to fight back, managers who are putting, health and safety at risk. It's great to hear stories about where we are able to tackle that and how the unions can help in doing it. I've got a question for Aimée. Just a few months ago, supporters of Socialist Alternative were out on the picket lines supporting university workers in their fight for decent pay, pensions and equality. Some union leaders have now been saying that because of COVID, we should suspend all struggle. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, right. I think it's important to talk about why the disputes have been suspended. And again, we're still technically in dispute, but there's just a few issues with that. So basically, for those of you who've been out on the picket lines, there's kind of two main planks. We've got the pensions, USS pensions dispute, and then we've got the 4 fights, which have to do with casualized workers in higher education, of which I am one, working on a 9-month contract. So that's really helpful, because if you remember in 2018, potentially folks might remember the set of strikes at that point. everyone went out to support pensions. We've been able to broaden the demands to include a lot more universities and also a lot more people. For example, people in post-92 universities won't have access to the USS pension fund. So broadening it to include these issues of casualization meant that we could bring more people into the fight. So I think that's very important. But yeah, so basically, we're technically still in active dispute. And we're sort of in a similar situation to the CWU, who again met their strike ballot after all of this chaos and then weren't able to go out and strike. We're in a slightly different position, but we're still in the position of having had a potential marking strike be blocked by COVID-19. So our reballot has been canceled, and it's not really clear where we are in terms of negotiations. And a lot of this also has to do with the trade union laws right now, the really repressive trade union laws, which mean that we have to ballot over and over again to meet a strike ballot to be able to go out on strike or to take industrial action. So that's important to remember. But yeah, we're technically still in the dispute, but up until recently, there was no set date for our union to meet, which has only been rectified recently. And I would say in general, union leaders right now are very reluctant to escalate for a number of reasons. One, they don't want to have like the ill will of the public. They're frightened about public perception of going out on strike in this kind of period. I want to say workers, on the other hand, have been walking off the job at different places and workplaces. It's an urgent need for workers to take action. So it's not, I mean, you know, workers who are taking action aren't necessarily worried about the same things as union leaders. But union leaders in general are reluctant to escalate right now. Management, on the other hand, is not showing this level of reluctance. I mean, we're seeing like a lot of universities are initiating hiring freezes. We've seen a lot of people be let go already very, very quickly. And a lot of universities are shifting to online teaching. Durham just announced that 25% of their modules are being cut. So privatization is already kind of kicking in right now. So if union leaders are reluctant to escalate, we really need grassroots action to put pressure on them and on our unions to take action, because otherwise we're really not going to be able to be a good line of defense against increasing privatization in higher education. I think students understandably feel a certain way about having their education disrupted. And this is in the context of escalating tuition fees, obviously, as well, which have doubled, tripled, you know, they're still rising basically from having been free. Education's gone up a huge amount within the last generation. But it's also about the working conditions at universities and what that tuition money translates to. For example, when I'm on strike, the amount of my pay that's being withheld would probably be enough to refund the students that I teach maybe like £1 or £2. Meanwhile, the vice chancellor of my university is going to get an £830,000 payout upon his retirement. That's in addition to how much he's earning in terms of his pension and pay. So that £830,000 is enough to employ someone like me for 40 years. Just to give you like a little bit of kind of setting the scene a little bit. So what do we actually need? I think what we need to be pushing for long-term to fix this permanently would be a nationally funded education and apprenticeship system that's paid for by a tax on the wealthy. And if we don't get that, what we're going to see is the increasing outsourcing and privatization of the university system, which is what we're already seeing. But in the short term, what we need to do is build grassroots action within our unions to make sure that union branches are empowered to meet, to call branch meetings, to call meetings of union leadership, and to fight back against all the privatization that we're starting to see. Yeah, so thanks.
Thank you very much for that. The UCU strike is obviously, you know, very important. Higher education is something that's incredibly important to young people, and we've seen attacks on it consistently for, I mean, not just the last decade, for a lot longer than that. So it's good to get a perspective from someone who's working in that. Next, we're staying in education. It's a story from Danny in Coventry, and they say, I was on placement in school when closures were announced. In the weeks leading up to the closures, we were given different advice on a daily basis, eventually being told that we would no longer be observed by our tutors and we'd have to complete additional work to make up for it. A few days later, the closures were announced. I had to wait for over 2 weeks after to find out whether students who couldn't complete their placements would still qualify. Since then, we've had a couple of dissertation clinics on Zoom, but no lectures and no one-to-one meetings. This is a massive reduction in contact hours, but we still have to pay our full tuition fees. Charlie, over the last decade, obviously, we have seen young people turning more and more towards an interest in the left and even socialist ideas. Tell us about your experiences of organising as a member of Socialist Alternative at the University of Huddersfield.
Thanks for that. Yeah, so yeah, I was talking a little bit about what sort of prompted myself to get involved with Socialist Alternative, I guess, as well as sort of some of my experiences of organising at the university. And I think, you know, myself and a lot of students are massively frustrated, really. I mean, we've lived through 10 years of austerity. We've now, you know, been given a new crisis to have to shoulder with COVID-19 and the lockdown and the impending economic downturn, which is coming along in the wind. This leftward track of students in general, I think it's sort of not funded, but sort of brought about by expectations and what you're being sold as the university experience, not really matching up with reality. You know, what we've got is very expensive courses, very expensive living costs, rent, things like that, and we've got nothing really concrete at the end of it. You know, we're not promised a job. We're not expected. I'm not expecting to be able to just walk into a degree or a postgraduate level employment. You know, this is something that working at the university with the UCU strike, which we've touched on earlier, has opened my eyes to, I guess, a little bit. But it's one of those things that I think it's this disillusionment with the marketisation of education. We're seeing, you know, students basically expected to saddle huge amounts of debt on a promise that you may eventually get a job which pays slightly more than the average. But turning to some of the work that I've done at the university, we've basically set up a society at the university, which is a brilliant way of engaging with students and student issues. We're also using it to promote the socialist message to the student body, which at the University of Huddersfield it's not got a particularly strong political tradition, but that's something we're aiming to sort of challenge and educate and organise within the student body. We were quite lucky in a way that we were able to sort of thrust ourselves into the UCU dispute as a fledgling society. We've been very, very vocal in our support of the UCU and our striking lecturers. We've visited picket lines daily, spoke with lecturers and students, and just tried to promote the reasons for going on strike rather than the university management's reasoning for the striking lecturers. Their information was quite miscommunicated, I guess would be the word. And what we've done as well, we've successfully held public meeting between the striking lecturers and students in order to promote a bit more of a solidarity mood between students and lecturers, so that they can't be played off against one another by the university. We've also, through enacting quite a large amount of pressure on the student union, we've forced them to take a stance, and a supportive stance on the dispute, with a view to hopefully keeping up that pressure and making sure that in subsequent disputes the student union knows which side it has got to be on, because the issues that are affecting the UCU lecturers are ones which impact on our learning and our university experience, and it's also makes much more sense to me, especially as a postgraduate student looking forward to an employment of short-term contracts and precarious employment, to solidify some links with the union and to solidify any sort of gains which can be made through striking and through the demands that the UCU are raising around casualised labour, really. I think I'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Charlie. I think you're right to raise the point of it's so important that we have that solidarity between students and the lecturers and support staff. Obviously, that is kind of the management will try and use that to, cause divisions. And doing that work is so important in making sure that, these kind of struggles are successful. Next, we have a story from Yara in North London. She says, I was made redundant out of the blue in mid-February, right before the whole crisis took shape. I went on a few job interviews and generally prospects seemed to be good with a lot of responses. Then the lockdown happened and everyone went underground. I stopped getting invited to interviews, the roles I interviewed for were cancelled, and it became clearer and clearer that as long as this crisis goes on, I won't be able to find a job. My redundancy pay will last me for a few months, but I'm not sure what I'm going to do after, which only adds to my already high anxiety levels. Jack, many young workers are facing this situation of either being furloughed or not being paid at all due to 0 hours or precarious contracts. What's your experience been of this?
Yeah. Well, like I said at the beginning, I'm usually somebody who works on the website of a legal firm, but I've been furloughed now for a couple of weeks. Originally, the plan at our company was to just have us work from home. And one of the things that was said to us by our employer was that this was going to be like a kind of a trial period of working from home, and that there would be a kind of a review at the end of this trial period. And they said that if they found that like productivity, had slacked as a result of people working from home, they would reverse it, and we would be expected to come back into work, which it kind of stands as an example of like what was going through some employers' heads, like this sort of failure to realise, that this was a crisis that was outside of their hands, and it really wasn't up to them whether or not, it would be possible for people to work from home or not. But about a week into working from home, we got the phone call off the employer saying that we were going to be furloughed and we were going to be put onto this government job retention scheme, where we receive 80% of our normal wages from the government, because as a result of the lockdown, our government wasn't doing any trade or any business, and it wasn't feasible for us to carry on working from home or otherwise. But I mean, in that regard, in terms of being a furloughed worker who just has to stay at home and receive 80% of my wages, I'm one of the lucky ones in a way, because for a lot of young people, the situation is far more difficult and much riskier for them. Young workers are probably disproportionately more likely to work in the retail sector and in the service sector. They're more likely, I think, to work on 0 hours contracts and precarious work and minimum wage work. So on the one hand, you've got, a lot of young workers who will be classed as key workers because they work in supermarkets. And so they'll still be required to, be potentially putting themselves at risk of contracting the virus by going to work in public places and interacting with people. And on the other hand, you'll also have, many, many young workers who, because they're on 0 hours contracts, may not be eligible to receive their normal, to receive the job retention scheme money. In those situations, their businesses might have simply just laid them off, and of course, we know what universal credit is like at the best of times. It's a, deliberately mismanaged system that, utterly fails to look after people when they're unemployed. Even at a time before this crisis when unemployment was fairly low, you could just imagine the kind of chaos that's going to ensue for people who need to claim benefits now that all of a sudden, virtually overnight, there's, upwards of 1 million or more people suddenly having to claim, claim universal credit. And of course, it's not just the virus itself and the lockdown, it's the economic prospects following from this. It has been confirmed now that, we are headed into an impending recession, which is probably going to, be more similar to the Great Depression in the 1930s rather than, the recession that occurred after 2008. And that is going to hit young people very hard, because it's going to hit the retail sector very hard. Prior to this, it was already in the headlines and the topic of much discussion that, the high street was in crisis, that one high street chain was after another was going under. And this crisis and the economic fallout of it is only going to accelerate that even further. And of course, looking forward to the end of this lockdown, one of the proposed policies for a return to normal and an end to this lockdown was that there would be a kind of a phased return to normal, that workers would be allowed, quote unquote, to return to work, in phases, in sections. And one of the first sets of workers who would be allowed to go back to work would be people in their 20s and 30s who don't live with their parents, based on the idea that, well, if you're in your 20s or your early 30s or under, you're less at risk, and so it's safer for you to go back to work. And I think we should totally oppose that, because I think people would quite rightly see that as us being put into the firing line, if you will, being used as guinea pigs to sort of test to see if it was safe for everyone else to go back to work. And I think we should oppose that. I think we should oppose that any kind of age discrimination of an end to the lockdown. I think young people and trade unions should take up the struggle to make sure that nobody has to go back to work unless their job is absolutely necessary, until it's been confirmed that they will be safe from the virus. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Jack. I think you're completely right to say that young people, we shouldn't be forced to go back to work earlier. And, we know that age is not the only risk factor in the COVID illness. Next, we have a story from Sammy in Brighton. The pandemic and the resulting social distancing measures are exacerbating the mental health crisis, which has been a looming burden upon students like myself for years now. Since becoming a student myself last September, I've seen the scale of this crisis firsthand, made much worse by the severe lack of support services to help students through periods of difficulty. The coronavirus pandemic has lit up several darkened corners of the capitalist system, the mental health crisis being one of them. Tom, many people, particularly young people, this outbreak is really making us question whether the system really works. Do you think capitalism is able to provide a real response to the coronavirus crisis?
Well, first off, can you see me, Jade? Very good. So first off, I'll say thanks to Sammy for sending that story in with many good points. It's certainly true that COVID-19 has exposed the darkest corners of capitalism, and the thing is, if you look at history, you see history is full of different shocks, lots of different experiences that and moments that lead people to question, whether the existing way of doing things, really works, whether it really works for the mass of people. And I think that coronavirus and the pandemic is an example of a case like that. And the thing is, on the issue of people questioning capitalism and whether or not capitalism will provide a decent way forward for working class and young people. More and more young people were already concluding that wasn't the case even before coronavirus. Coronavirus has just had the effect of compounding that. You look at, as Sammy mentioned, the very severe lack of mental health support for, both workers relying on the NHS, but also students, living in accommodation, facing the various pressures of academic life. And ultimately, can make a very obvious point that, you know, it reflects what the Tories have done, you know, to our NHS for a period of decades. You know, this pattern of, you know, running it down, underfunding it, privatizing it, you know, in stages over decades, and it, you know, really, you know, as an aside, raises the need for, you know, coordinated demonstrations and strike action, you know, to properly save the NHS as soon as it's possible and safe to do so. And also, I mean, capitalism was already being questioned by young people on the issue of the climate too. You know, there was a Socialist Alternative. You know, we regularly intervened and took part in the climate strikes, you know, before the pandemic kind of took over. And when we would raise this point that it was capitalism driving climate change, nobody would disagree with that. So it shows, you know, a real advancement in terms of people's ideas. And the thing is, now with COVID-19, the ruling class really kind of wants us to conveniently forget that, you know, the climate crisis is such a huge issue, but people won't. You know, the urgency of it is still there just as much as it was previously. Now, another thing that I kind of want to mention from Sammy's story as well about, you know, the link between COVID-19 and capitalism is, you know, you see this line of argument from the Tories. You see this line put forward, you know, from the Tories, from the right-wing press, and unfortunately, actually, from, you know, Keir Starmer as Labour leader now, which is to say, you know, we're all coming together. Let's stop criticising, you know, people as Tories or criticising, you know, the ruling class and things like this. But I mean, to kind of get a little bit anecdotal, I was actually in Tesco the other day, where I saw, you know, workers on the tills, you know, most of which, you know, were roughly similar ages to us, you know, late teens to, you know, the late 20s. And they were wearing T-shirts that said, "We are all in this together." And I found that quite funny, because I would imagine, and I'll really sort of go out on a limb and say, the workers wearing those T-shirts wouldn't have seen it that way. You know, they were workers who had no personal protective equipment. They had, you know, no screens on the tills to protect them from the risk of infection. But, you know, the major shareholders and, you know, the CEO of Tesco, they won't have to live and work in those kinds of conditions. So it's not reasonable to say that we are all in this together. You know, as workers and young people, we're certainly all in it together, but not with the ruling class. And yeah, so at the same time, you know, this kind of this line that the Tories have tried to put forward of, oh, you know, we're socially minded now, we're all in this together, you know, we're in the same boat as you. They've tried to, you know, push that line forward with this job retention scheme that Jack was talking about just then, and that's quite a funny one, because that was put forward clearly as an attempt by the Tories to stave off opposition to their government, you know, to try and make it look like, oh, we're really caring for the workers. Doesn't this just show that, you know, capitalism can deliver for ordinary people? But you've actually seen since that an estimated 3 times the amount of employers have applied to this job retention scheme compared to what was predicted. So even employers who can still afford to pay their workers, many of which will be, you know, young workers, are still claiming it. And it really kind of, it serves as an indictment of the capitalist system, you know, that there is a risk of millions of deaths taking place worldwide, while, you know, the big major employers are seeking to, you know, cash in on it. It really says a lot about, you know, the way that the system functions. And I think that a lot of people, and this won't be an immediate thing, I think a lot of people now are just sort of more concerned about, you know, their immediate health and things like that. And that is something that obviously, you know, we've all got to be sympathetic to, and we've all got to, you know, take care of our own health. But more and more people would begin to think, well, you know, imagine if this hoarded wealth, you know, that the ruling class, the capitalist class, had taken control of. Imagine if that wealth was used to, you know, relieve the pandemic. A lot of people will draw the conclusion, I think, that you know, the pandemic could have been contained from the very beginning, we wouldn't be in this situation now were it not for, you know, the drive for profits at the top of society. So it really won't. I don't think it will surprise any of us in this call right now. It won't surprise you know, us as socialists when more and more, you know, young people under the weight of the, you know, the pandemic turn more and more towards, you know, anti-capitalist and even, you know, socialist ideas. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. I think you're right to raise the point that we're not all in this together, because, you know, you have people like Richard Branson, who's able to seclude himself on his own private island. Meanwhile, he's, you know, laying off staff and asking the government for bailouts. You know, the reality is that the working class, you know, then they have to fight for our own. So next we've got two stories about sort of some of the ways that work is being hit. So we've got one from Sophia in Leicester, who says, "I've lost all my income as the place I work at are all closed. The staffing agency I do most of my work through have apparently just cancelled all contracts and won't be furloughing workers. So I'm currently speaking to my union, HR, etc. to get them to do the right thing." And we've got another one from Jamie in York, who says, "I'm a care worker. I started this job on a part-time basis while a student, but have continued in it since graduating as I have been unable to find graduate work. The lack of PPE in the private sector, in the private care sector, is an extremely significant issue where the health of staff members and the people we care for are being put at risk on a daily basis as PPE is being rationed due to the shortage of equipment." I was wondering if someone from the panel could comment on this. So Neil, right now the unions have a huge task in fighting for a real bailout for young workers, along with PPE for our staff. What should the unions be doing to fight for this?
Yeah, and I think the example from Jamie there kind of represents what the priorities are first and foremost. Because the idea that there's not enough personal protective equipment, the idea that people working in essential workplaces can't be kept safe at work is false, because we've seen that when society needs these things, they can be provided for. You've seen after humongous pressure from workers and their unions, the job retention scheme being put in place, after huge pressure and even spontaneous walkouts in food production. We had ABP Meats in Lurgan in Northern Ireland and Moy Park, one of the largest suppliers of chicken to the UK of Ireland. In place of there not being proper social distancing measures and PPE, those workers took the decision to take that into their own hands and remove themselves from a dangerous situation. And that forced the hand of the boss, because ultimately for the boss to continue making their profits during this crisis, and indeed any time, it's the workers that are producing the goods and producing the profits. So we could have workers working in factories that are non-essential and still being forced to come in, producing the PPE, producing the goods that the health and the care sector need. And unions should and are getting behind workers who don't feel safe at work. And actually the union leaderships need to step up, because it's been workers and union activists that have been leading the way and showing us that we can do it. And it's actually the union leaderships that are behind the times, and their response has been lethargic compared to where the majority of the working class are at the moment. I think in terms of coming out of this crisis, over the past few weeks, we've seen our Unite Hospitality branch double in membership. And I think we're going through a process now where people are trying to defend their lot. People are trying to get the best advice, trying to fight back and work, to guarantee a livelihood. And I think we've seen, obviously, the Johnson government with the job retention scheme, with all the supports they put in place. The first announcement on the 20th of March from the Chancellor in terms of deferring business rates, announcing the furlough scheme, came as a shock the most. But that was attempting to hold back the huge pressure that workers were facing. But it was done in a business friendly way, because the decision on whether workers can have a livelihood or not, despite breaking their backs for companies for years, particularly in hospitality, where you came off the busy Christmas festive period. You've seen a record break in January and February, where bosses 2 weeks into this crisis were celebrating just the sheer amount of profit that they've made, that there's been a recovery in the economy. And now you see this where workers are being laid off. And that's very much the example that Sophia has gave, where despite all of these measures being put in place, it's still in the hands of the boss whether they're going to decide to furlough somebody. And it's still in the hands of the boss whether they're going to pay. The government's obviously hoped that that guarantee of wages at the end of April here will mean that bosses will pay at least 80% of wages. I mean, it's not a hell of a lot compared to the sheer amount of profits in the majority of sectors where workers are being furloughed and laid off en masse, particularly in these huge employment agencies where they could afford to essentially pay wages on tick until the end of the month. You've now got the guarantee. You've got huge extension of loans and credit to businesses. You've got grants for small businesses and for larger hospitality businesses, and there's still this refusal. And I think it really is the bosses ramping up and realizing coming out of this crisis that they can change things, and they can further kind of set the bottom level of employment in terms of a race to the bottom. So I think the response of the unions, the response of workers who are getting organised at the moment, and anyone who isn't, they should join a union, but they should also put pressure on their union to act. In hospitality, we're going to be demanding a new deal for hospitality workers. Certainly, a lot of people have learned the lesson very hard about the relationship between themselves and their boss. And I think coming out of this, one of the likely perspectives is actually there's going to be a bit of a fighting mood coming out of this, where people are going to be fighting against the idea of opportunistic layoffs and redundancies, which are very likely in a huge amount of sectors, probably including retail and food distribution coming out of this, but certainly in hospitality as well. And as well as that, I think people will be demanding higher wages, and people will be demanding proper respect and dignity, because it just has went to show how people have just been cast aside, kicked to the curb throughout this crisis. That something has to be done, and I think people are starting to realize they should be in a union and they can fight back. And the example of workers fighting back and demanding PPE has been a strong one for people. But even just simple things like people getting unionized and demanding their boss pays the furlough pay early, or even we've seen just last week workers in the Premier Inn now getting paid 100% of their pay whilst being furloughed, and that should be the norm. You know, it doesn't seem that should be a union demand, that we're asking people to be paid 100% of their normal wage during a crisis, but that's a victory. Workers who are going in hotels that have been requisitioned for health service use are now getting paid a premium, and that's really demonstrated to young workers maybe never been in contact or never seen the union as a method of struggle before, that there is a space there and we can demand these things, and under pressure, when push comes to shove, the boss needs us to make profits. So if workers are refusing to come in, they can demand premiums and stuff like that. And certainly in the health and care sector, that's a lot harder to do, but backed up by unions and by a fighting, combative union leadership and union activists, they can demand the PPE. You know, society can provide this. You know, our economic system can provide this. It's just a question of who's in power, and the people in power at the moment, the bosses and the politicians, just aren't interested.
Thank you very much for that, Neil. I think you're clearly right that the bosses will attempt to, capitalise on the position that we'll find ourselves in after this, to cut conditions, to further casualise work, and the fight will really be on for the unions to fight against that, because coming out of this, we can't be doing with casualised work, 0 hours contracts. Young people need better conditions. I've got a question for Aimée. You said earlier that the fight of the university workers will still go on in spite of the outbreak. Do you think there is serious potential for the workers to not just win small concessions, but to beat the market out of education?
Okay, yeah. I think that's a real goal, to end the marketization of education. I think that's what we all want. Frankly, I don't think we can have half measures if we don't eventually reverse and eliminate the privatization of education. We won't have an education system in terms of what we're seeing right now. We won't have a higher education system, or we'll have something that barely resembles a higher education system. I mean, again, I think a lot of what Neil said really applies to the university struggles too. There have been small wins, and like those really shouldn't be seen as small. They're examples of workers taking action and really demanding what they deserve. So we've had similar things in terms of grassroots groups of people putting pressure on the union to act. We have had some examples of topping up the furlough scheme, for example, from 80% to 100%. And again, I think that's a great demand. I think it's important to note also that up until maybe like 1 week ago, we really, and we still have no clarity on this actually. So it's important to point that out. We had no clarity on whether the workers that are being let go at universities would be eligible for the furlough scheme. That might seem ridiculous given that you assume that we're workers like anybody else, but in general, university contracts are so, they're written in such a difficult way. A lot of us are on very different contracts from one another, deliberately so, I think, because it makes it harder for us to negotiate. We're all on different kinds of hours. You know, some people are on fractional contracts, some people are on hourly contracts, some people are PhDs and they're doing teaching assistant jobs, and some people are on 0 hours contracts and so on, sometimes represented by different unions. So all of that makes it very hard in some ways to fight back. And so the universities were not adding people onto the furlough scheme. So one of the things that we've been able to do is really push as hard as we can for that to at least be the first step for people to be added onto the furlough scheme, and for the university to top it up to 100%. Not the 80% that's being offered. That's very important, especially because there's a lot of international staff at universities, and an 80% cut, if you're on a tier 2 visa, for example, that's a work visa, and your income drops to 80%, you might be deported. So there's very serious reasons why we're demanding that. So there have been small wins around that. I think also UKVI just talked about extending, they've offered a 6-month extension to all researchers. That's a really big deal. But we're hoping for a bigger win. And so I've organized with others this campaign called Corona Contract, which is about organizing for a 2-year extension, 2-year secure contracts for all casualized workers in universities, given that we're expecting potentially hiring freezes for the next 2 years. We think it's completely reasonable that universities dig deep and try to find somewhere in their budgets where they can continue to employ us, who tend to be, again, the lowest paid workers. And potentially, if that means the vice chancellor needs to take a pay cut, then that's what needs to happen. So, and also, of course, the government needs to help bail out some of the universities that are struggling. So, and universities need to be petitioning the government for those bailouts. It's ridiculous that they would just leave us to kind of flounder about in a job market where there's no jobs when they can simply extend our contracts. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of a win. Again, we're getting these small wins. I don't think that's enough. I think 2 years is really the minimum to make it livable for everybody, because we really don't know how long the economic fallout from this is going to last in terms of managers justifying hiring freezes and so on. So that's the kind of bare minimum. But I agree that the long-term vision has to be a complete restructuring of the education system. They're trying to restructure it to be completely privatized. Durham University just cut 25% of its in-person modules and is shifting to an online provision system. Now, for most of us, the idea of a YouTube video replacing our jobs is pretty terrifying. But that's what we're facing. And for students, I think you need to think about this, that like what you might end up paying, again, thousands and thousands of pounds and going into severe debt for is basically a recording that just ends up being like proprietary to the university. So a recording of me lecturing or something, you can cut me out, and then, but you still have to pay. So that's the kind of vision that they're hoping to build towards. And if we don't kind of take it into our own hands as workers and as students and say that's not the kind of education system that we want to have. We want to have a fully free education system where workers are paid a decent wage, and that's all workers in the university system, from cleaners to professors. If we don't do that, they're going to do something else, basically. So here's hoping that we kind of build towards more and more wins and put on the pressure in our unions and so on, because that's really what we need to do.
Thank you so much for that. Obviously, I mentioned earlier, we all know that education is extremely important, and attacking the workers who are providing our young people with the knowledge that they need to go out into the world of work it's ridiculous. And we are going to see them attempt to attack workers' rights on this, and we really have to make sure that we are working for a really great education system that's free for our students. Next up, we've got two stories on sort of how this crisis is affecting young people's ability to pay rent. We've got a story from Rocha in North London, who says, despite moving back home, I am still being held liable for 5 months of London rent for an empty room. The landlord ends his emails with #stay-home, #clap NHS, #we're in this together. The same emails that include threats that a rent holiday is not a break from rent, and interest will be added to tenants' arrears. And we have another story from Dan in Brighton, who says, my experience so far has been one of anxiety for myself and others around me. Letting agents and my landlord were quick to confirm that there will be no changes to rent, despite the complete freeze to income that many are feeling. Friends confess their own fears that once their savings dwindle, they'll have no more options. Students as a group in Brighton already deal with unsafe living conditions and predatory landlords, and the insistence that rent will be collected blindly regardless shows the blatantly parasitic nature of landlords and their related agencies. Charlie, one issue has been particularly exposed as the dire situation facing many renters, both students in student accommodation and young workers outside, where landlords and letting agents refuse to cancel rents, despite most students not living in accommodation now. What do you think the student movement should do next to fight for the rights of student renters?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a terrible situation that we're all, as young renters, we're finding ourselves in. I think I've just been having a look on what the actual National Union of Students advice is around this issue. And as of yet, there's 52 universities in England who are still to decide on whether or not they're going to refund or waive rent for third term. And 80% of students actually rent privately. So it sort of feeds into that marketisation of education argument around this sort of split and confusion between, private rent, university rent, halls which are run by universities, halls which are run by private companies. And the student movement itself, they need to be more proactive. They need to be more aggressive in their stance against exploitative practices by landlords. Landlords aren't accepting the fact that we're living in unprecedented times, and it's frankly immoral that you should be expected to pay for an empty room that you're no longer using and you cannot use because you've been told by medical advice and by the government to go home to your parents or your guardians. And there's also an issue of students, many of them overseas students in the UK, who have found themselves trapped in abandoned campuses, who are you know, they can't go home. They're stuck in a foreign country. They're stuck with very little support, and they're being told, obviously, that they're expected to pay a massive amount of money. Well, they have no income. They have no source of money, really. I mean, there have been organising on the grassroots level of these renters who have found themselves in these situations. They're organising rent strikes across the country, which, you know, we would stand in solidarity with them. We would say, you know, if you can't pay, then don't pay. You know, you can't be expected to prop up landlords who, as the fact that being a landlord is their business, they will no doubt be able to claim on insurance. They'll be able to, well, not necessarily insurance, but they'll be able to claim on government schemes, get loans at reduced rates and things to help them through this. Yet they are not passing this on to their tenants. And just something else, you know, looking forward out of the COVID crisis, Shelter, which is a charity for renters and homelessness, they're predicting that 1.7 million people renting in this country could lose their homes as a result of the economic fallout from COVID-19 and the recession which is looming. So I think we need to be strengthening renters' organisations. We need to be looking at getting organised on the ground. Also looking at, you know, putting pressure on unions and the Labour movement and the Labour Party to vocalise and support renters, both students and workers, to not only support us in our struggle with the very current issue of rent furloughing, for want of a better phrase, but also to campaign around the actual quality of housing stock that students and young workers are subjected to. I mean, over my shoulder, most of you can probably see a horrendous amount of damp, which has been growing for about 2 years. I've been living in this property for 2 years now, and we've had damp for 2 years. So it's not simply just rental issues. We've got an unwillingness on the part of landlords to actually spend money to bring houses up to a standard which is actually livable. But we have to put up with this because what is the other option? You know, we've got no social housing, we've got no council housing stock which is available for young people or students, and we're looking at, you know, the quality of housing deteriorate rapidly, and we're just expected to put up and shut up, really. But before I want to sort of finish, before I go on a bit of a rant, I guess, and just say, you know, we need to reiterate this issue of we need to be fighting for rent controls and rent freezes, in the very least at the present time, and to get some solid stuff from the government to provide us with support in taking on these landlords. And I think I'll leave it there, really, and put it back to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Charlie. I think it's very important that you brought up the issue of council housing, because a private landlord is going to try and make as much profit as they can. You know, they're going to let their buildings get dilapidated. They're going to make you pay rent even when you can't pay rent. And so, you know, council housing really is a big issue, and it will be going forwards in the economic crisis as well. Just a couple of last questions to ask the panelists. Got a question for Jack, and that is, do you think that the COVID-19 crisis will further inflame growing anti-Tory mood from young people? Will more young people question capitalism as a result of this?
Hi, yeah. Yes is the short answer to that. I'm quite sure of that. I think that, you know, it would come on the back of an increasing radicalization of young people that has already occurred. You know, you can see the surge of young people supporting Jeremy Corbyn here in the UK. You could also see a similar thing of young people, a similar situation of young people falling behind kind of, relatively radical left-wing politics of Bernie Sanders in America, and the rejection of the Democratic Party and the rejection of Joe Biden over there. You can see, you can see the huge, climate strike movement, which is comprised mainly of young people, of students, and of school students. That's taken place over the last year or so, and the degree to which that has become politicized, and the degree to which that has become, radicalized, as opposed to simply being this kind of, general, oh, isn't global warming bad type of movement. And there's a lot of people who try and sort of write off this as just like, oh well, young people are just radical, like, being left wing when you're a young person is just a part of growing up, and you'll become, more of a Tory as you get older and become more mature. But I think, you've got to look at, the historical context of the last couple of years, and you've got to think of, what have been some of the events that, people of our age, of our generation have lived through and have sort of formed our our outlook and our perspectives. You look over the last 10, 15 years or so, you've seen, of course, the financial crash of 2007, 2008, the recession that followed that, the austerity that's followed that, the emergence of climate change as an existential crisis for essentially all of human society, and now, of course, you've got not only a pandemic, which in and of itself is probably going to, at this point, kill tens of thousands of people, cause tens of thousands of preventable deaths just here in the UK alone, which in turn is triggering, as we've been discussing this evening, a tremendous economic recession, which is going to have a huge impact, which is probably going to rival, the Great Depression of the 1930s in terms of its scale. I think, that can't help but radicalize people. I think it's a situation where, just in terms of the objective facts, it's exposing capitalism as a system which is completely unable to deal with, with potential disasters like climate change, like COVID-19. It's a system of one crisis after another, and I think for people of our age, for young people, they've never known, capitalism where it wasn't all going horribly wrong. You've got, one recession followed by 10 years of austerity and of stagnation and of degradation of people's standards of living, followed by an even more severe crisis and even more, severe economic recession on the back of this pandemic. So I think, yeah, absolutely. I think a massive number of young people are going to be very radicalized by this. I think it's going to be, the coming period is going to cause a lot of pain and a lot of hardship, but it's also going to create, a large degree of anger and of radicalization and of, young people moving into political struggles, in trade unions, in tenants unions, in political parties, and so on.
Thank you very much, Jack. I think you're right. I think this crisis is going to see people moving leftwards, especially young people. And I think that leads us into the final question quite nicely, which is I'm going to ask Tom, what kind of programme is going to be necessary for us to fully address this outbreak?
Okay, I think that is a very good question to finish up on, and I think that was a very good contribution from Jack just then. I guess on the issue of what sort of program, I mean, I'll start by saying that I think everybody, in this this discussion panel tonight is all in agreement that we can't go back to business as usual as a result of COVID-19. Things can't, and they won't go back to the way that they were beforehand. And I think that right now, the attitude of a lot of people is that I just want to ensure that I'm safe, that my family's safe, people that I know, my neighbours are safe, and so on. And that's kind of the main focus of a lot of people at this particular point in time. But the idea that things can't go back to normal and that there does have to be, a radical change in society, I think that's going to become much more dominant as a result of this. And there's no way that, as Jack just said, there's no way that it could be any other way after, a huge shock like this. And I think, I think we've seen a small glimpse into that attitude in the weekly clap for carers. Carers like Jamie, the young carer who sent his story in earlier. And of course, we have to honour carers like Jamie and all carers involved in that field of work, by taking part in the claps every week and mobilising for them, organising for them among neighbours, within safe limits, but also always making the point, as we would do as members of Socialist Alternative, that this has to go towards exposing the Tories for what they are, because they're completely bound up. Exposing them as a very, very bankrupt, ruthless capitalist party that don't fundamentally have the interests of their working people and young people at heart. And I think another thing that we've began to see is very small but significant examples of workers moving into action. There was the case of postal workers, particularly in Scotland, but I think elsewhere, going out, basically taking part in action short of a strike, if I'm correct about that, because they were being told by Royal Mail management, you have to deliver junk mail. You have to put your health at risk for mail that's not necessary to deliver. That's a completely legitimate demand in a situation like this. And you saw similar, bits of action from workers in the ASOS warehouse, ASOS, the clothes company online, who were raising very, very, genuine, legitimate grievances about management doing absolutely nothing to allow for the workers to carry out, responsible levels of social distancing. And there are going to be more and more cases like this, and that's going to make it very clear that in every workplace, if there is no union organisation, if the workers aren't organised, then there's no accountability, and makes it much more likely for the health and safety and the well-being of the workers to be sacrificed in the name of profits for the CEOs and the shareholders. Obviously, we've also seen the rent strikes among students. There was, I think it was in Bristol, in Edinburgh, in London, and also in Portsmouth, and a number of other places where students were basically saying, as has kind of been touched on previously, we're not living in this accommodation now for very obvious reasons. We can't afford to pay this rent at this particular point, so we're just not going to pay it, and it's within our rights to do that. I think it's very vital that we support that, and we not just support them, but also intervene and advance them as much as we possibly can. And it will be key. I think we would all agree in Socialist Alternative, it would be key to do what we can to link them up. Link them up with climate campaigns, with young workers campaigns, like Neil was talking about with Unite Hospitality in Northern Ireland, into a united force that can challenge, rip-off rents, can challenge, precarious and insecure work after the COVID crisis, can challenge, the domination of the big polluting companies, but also unify that as part of a struggle to challenge the system of capitalism itself, because that's what it all springs out from. That's what all of these situations spring from. But as for a programme, I mean, it's very clear that we need a coordinated response that capitalism can't deliver, as we've already touched on. That will pose the question of the need for, a socialist government, a socialist reorganisation of society where, workers and young people are organising and fighting themselves for that change, rather than, just expecting it to be passed through Parliament. It's our job to fight for these things in the workplaces and on the streets. And of course, there are very, very important key demands that we should be putting forward, and we do put forward in a Socialist Alternative. So, for example, we would demand non-essential workplaces, all non-essential workplaces, and actually non-essential workplaces, to be, closed down, but closed down under the control of the workers themselves, under workers' control, where you would have, full sick pay, so not, workers risking being forced out onto the streets because they're no longer being paid anything close to what they were beforehand. So there should be full sick pay, actually coming from the pockets of the bosses themselves, who actually have the means to pay, but often won't do because that goes against, the drive for profits that is at the centre of the system. Other things like, the requisition of private hospital beds. There's a huge amount of beds in private hospitals that aren't being used at this particular point in time, while, there's a very, very severe lack of them in the NHS. So it would be key to requisition those, and also to fully renationalise the NHS. So after coronavirus, we can guarantee that after kicking out the privatising companies, that something like this never happens again. That has to really be stressed. But really, the most important thing that we would have to put forward as a socialist organisation is the need to fundamentally break from the way that society is organised under capitalism. Taking very, very important steps like nationalising the big pharmaceutical companies, big pharma, under again democratic workers' control, along with the major the banks, the major corporations, the key sections of the economy. And it would be on that basis, moving towards socialist planning, that you would allow for proper public funding, for public research into the possibility of a vaccine, to be provided free of charge, and also for funding for things like ventilators, testing kits. So this would actually be coordinated to meet the needs of ordinary people, and not of the profiteers that sit at the top of society. And on that basis, you could have very, very very significant advances in treating diseases and developing vaccines, not just coronavirus, but all the other diseases that cause havoc around the world, particularly in the neo-colonial world, in Africa, Asia, Latin America. I'll just say a couple of things before I finish. I think that this has been an excellent discussion. I think it's been good for us all to come together and have this discussion. I hope we can do this again some other time. And I'll just sort of make an appeal to anybody that is listening right now. If you agree with what we've said in this call, if you think that you're in agreement with the points that we're putting forward, the first things that I think you should do is seriously consider joining Socialist Alternative. You should get in touch. We'll get back to you. We'll see if there's a group in your area that you can get involved in, and message us on the Facebook page, and also go to our website socialistalternative.net, where you can read some of our articles, what we have to say about the COVID crisis more broadly, and get in contact with us too. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. It was obviously quite a big question for you to summarise, but it was very succinct. And also, thank you to all of our panellists. I think they've done a great job of discussing some quite, complex topics at times. I just want to echo what Tom said at the end. If you are interested, if you've listened to this and you think that our ideas are the ideas that we should be taking forward, please do get in touch. Please, think about joining. But also, someone will be posting a donation link in the chat. A lot of the work that we do, we have to print and, travel to different demonstrations. Not at the minute, but at some point we will be traveling to demonstrations again. A lot of this work, it's not free. And obviously we don't have millionaire backers that pay for our material. So if you could just make, a small donation or a larger donation if you're able to, there will be a link in the chat that, please consider doing that. And so I want to finish it off by saying thank you again to all the panelists. But also, especially thank you to everyone watching. You know, I hope you have taken something away from this that's been helpful for you. And there'll be another one next Friday. If you want to come again, please do. Cheers.